Gravedigger Queen here with another story of the vampire. Yes, another one of those. But when you think about it, there ain't nothing more apple pie than a vampire. Tonight, Tale asked the question, what exactly do vampires do when they go on vacation? I mean, it really don't pay for them to be too far away from people. But on the other hand, I believe it would be exhausting to have to always be watching your back against other monsters equally as cunning as you. So, vampires on an island getaway in Jupiter, Florida. Why not? The name of tonight's tale is Life on Jupiter by Montsho Shelby. He woke gently. He reached out from the dark box he slumbered in for a cup which he did not see but instinctively knew would be there. The man wore a white dress shirt, but he rolled up the sleeves to receive his nourishment. Though he was a handsome man, he looked nothing more than a monster when he gorged himself on human blood. After sated, he handed over his cup, then stepped out of the box. A short Latin American man helped him into his suit vest. He stepped off of his plane to see his limousine waiting for him. It was a beautiful moonlit night in Florida. Wilbur Meeks had times when he had to get away, times when life in New Orleans became a drudgery. He was a man of the people. Parties, rumors, scandals, these things were all synonymous with the persona he had built for himself. But most never got to see how being the life of the party weighed on him. It was sometimes a burden to have to be turned up to 11 whenever you were with people. Sometimes he'd just slip away. When he needed to get away, he usually took a night or two off in his mansion in Jupiter, Florida. It was a little-known haven for the wealthiest and most elite kindred in America when they needed respite. He had met many kindred from many different places in the world he otherwise would have never encountered in the microcosm of New Orleans. Meeks was relatively quiet on the quaint car ride to the ferry that took him to the island. He glanced at Paulo, his servant, from time to time, but was too emotionally wiped to speak. The island of Jupiter was for the elite of the mortal population, and that carried over to the kindred world as well. There were under 2,000 people that lived in Jupiter Island, Florida, and all were rich and famous. From a kindred standpoint, it was a horrible place to live. The price for solitude in this tranquil island town was high, but worth it in Meek's opinion. You had to bring your own food, and you couldn't run out because hunting on Jupiter Island was forbidding. The masquerade was the strictest he had ever seen it anywhere he'd ever been, and there tended to never be more than 4 or 5 kindred there at any given time. So there was usually no one to talk to, at least no one that mattered. Meeks didn't go for the cons of the island, but for the pros. And that was there usually were never more kindred than you could count on your hand in this place. And even when they were there, he rarely spoke with them. It was said the island itself was protected by a coterie of 4, maybe 6 elders. Or so the rumor went, who were so old, elder was almost an incorrect measure of their age. He had heard rumors that the coterie were ancient Native American kindred who slept in the dirt and arose only when they were needed. Centuries ago, he heard of a sect called the Darknessborn, a group of Native American kindred hell-bent on destroying settler kindred with powers of protean so great they could wake when needed. But if that were true, they seriously reconsidered their position on immigrating vampires. Maybe it was inevitable, Meeks thought, indulging his extended daydream. It was told to him years ago by a kindred named Prince Kyoto that he met while visiting Jupiter, that the old ones took your blood at night when you slept as payment for the peace and tranquility of the land. But he had never seen anyone, even though at times he did have his suspicions. It was the oddest thing. He had never seen any security or kindred infrastructure there, yet everyone knew the rules and did not break them. He at times wondered if the supposed elders that safeguarded the land of Jupiter were just a myth made to keep people in line when they passed through. Much like an unwatched security camera that gave you the illusion you were being watched, even if you were not. Meek's limo drove onto the ferry, and when it was secured on the boat, he stepped out. He looked at the dark waters and let the calm wash over him. He just needed to forget New Orleans ever existed for a night or two. When the boat landed, Meeks took notice. His attendant, Paulo, was no longer in the car, but he had just now noticed. Meeks looked out of his tinted window to see Paulo talking to a police officer. The elder Kendrick could have turned up his senses to hear what the two were talking about, but he didn't. At times, he felt weighted down by the constraints of conversation. Bored even. Meeks read the two's auras, deciphering the intangible colors that their emotions produced. Paulo was suspicious and nervous. Meeks smirked. That was the correct emotion for any goal of his, other than Sam. Meeks looked away from the two briefly, having just made himself sad at the ghoul he lost. The friend, the only friend he had in 200 plus years. Sam was different. He was his friend before he was even a vampire, and looked over him long before he had to. Meeks put his eyes back on the policeman and Paulo attempting to block out old ghosts, which was becoming harder and harder the more years he lived. The officer wore shorts due to the Florida heat, and his aura swayed softly like the fog of incense. Bits of suspicion peppered with sprinkles of concern. He must have been in a passive emotional state how level he was. There wasn't much urgency in his behavior. The cop leaned in, almost face to face with Meeks, though he couldn't see past the tint of the window. Paulo smiled at the cop, who just walked behind the car towards the ferry. Paulo opened the car door and casually reclaimed his position. Meeks didn't ask what the cop wanted because he wasn't yet concerned. They wordlessly drove to Meeks' mansion. To say it was a big home was an understatement. It was huge and had a view of the ocean and the iconic lighthouse. On the long drive up, Meeks noticed that the light in the guest house was on. The elder Kendrick broke his silence. "Is someone here?" Paulo looked up as if he had drifted off into his own private world, the same as Meeks had. Then he replied in a heavy Spanish accent, "Yeah, Ramon is here." Meeks looked up as if in thought. It's not that time of year for him, he said almost to himself. Paulo volunteered a tidbit of information, knowing his master may find it relevant. "He's been there for 3 months. Meeks raised a curious eyebrow. 3. Paulo nodded as if he was not mistaken. The limo stopped at the door and Paulo exited the car so he could open it for Meeks. The elder vampire hadn't expected anyone to be there, and now he was a bit disappointed that he may have to maintain airs and entertain. Meeks casually walked through the threshold of his second home. The colors were much more festive here than in his New Orleans plantation-style mansion. There were dashes of yellow and greens amongst the decor, colors he tended to stay away from normally. He heard in the distance music playing, something up-tempo like calypso, but he could barely make it out. "Summon him here," Meeks said to Paulo while dismissing him from his thoughts almost instantly after he made his declaration. He didn't even watch him leave the room when he moved through the living room towards the terrace. The connecting door was unlocked, and for some reason that bothered Meeks. Even if it was just his servants moving to and fro, it was something about that lack of self-preservation that niggled at him. The elder Kendrick leaned over a railing and saw lights in the distance on the beach. He enhanced his sight to get more information and realized it must have been some famous rapper doing an event, more than likely a resident. Meeks smirked. He didn't mind rap, even though he didn't particularly care for it. He respected the party. It didn't matter who was throwing it. Parties helped you get a clear understanding of the social order in one night as opposed to months of trial and error. Meeks casually looked over the party in the distance, giving it no more thought than one may a television show randomly stumbled upon. Ramon approached. He could smell his cologne. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was distinctive. Meeks didn't turn around before he spoke. "Hola, Ramon," he said while facing the younger Kendrick and putting his back to the railing. Ramon didn't wear a shirt. He had on jogging pants. He was in excellent shape and would always be 23 due to his vampiric state. Ramon smirked slightly, but it was reserved, as if he had mixed feelings he had to contend with. Ramon was clean-shaven with Latin features. "Hey," Ramon said neutrally. I see you've been working out, Meeks said as a joke, knowing that no manner of exercise could change his physique. Welcome back, huh? Said Ramon while patting the elder kindred on the shoulder. Meeks looked at his shoulder quizzically, as if to wonder where all this familiarity came from. So 3 months. 3 months, huh? Long vacation, Ramon. I didn't think House Darton just let bottoms just sit back and drink Long Islands, Meeks said, gazing at Ramon's aura, curious to see the response to this question. The pause in between his reply made him look guilty. Anything more than 3 seconds looked guilty. They just stuck me here until they found something for me to do, said Ramon. Right. The way your house sends out minions like probes seems a bit out of character, Meeks said in a high-pitched, sarcastic tone. Ramon's aura was swirling with fear, and it only made Meeks laugh. House Darton, House Piro, and Meeks all shared use of this mansion, a development that came about in the 1950s. The 3 factions all spoke one starry night and realized it made no sense to buy a mansion in one of the most expensive places in America just to slip away for the weekend. For 60 years, the arrangement had worked out. They had Paulo, the caretaker of the house, manage the day-to-day and attend to the needs of all 3 factions. And in 60 years, it had never caused any friction. Meeks had a special connection to both houses, even though both were on 2 different sides of the country. He was a contact for a House Darton agent they sent to New Orleans to deal with an oil spill that happened a few years back, and was a go-between with House Piro when Faywell needed to contract a specialist to spin the disaster that happened in the Monticello Hotel in the Lilith debacle. It was these little connections that Meeks established that made him indispensable in New Orleans. Invisible contracts he had made throughout his years that cemented his status on top of the heap of Invictus. All of this came from socialization, a thing that seemed so simple to do, and it was, but it was hard to do well. Why don't I call up your high-ups? I can get you squared away, Meeks said with a smile that held back laughter. Seeing Ramon squirm was tickling his funny bone. No thank you, but I don't need any help, said Ramon awkwardly. Meeks let it go for now. If it amused or interested him, he'd lean on him later and find out why he was really here. Meeks shifted gears and repositioned himself to stare out at the distant beach party. Ramon took the social cue and leaned on the terrace railing. Meeks was much older than Ramon, the superior predator. And in the matter of the hierarchy in this mansion getaway, age defined status. Luckily for him, there weren't very many more older than him. Maybe other than a handful in House Darton. But any older than him, and it was almost certain they were drinking from other kindred, and most preferred to keep that information close to the vest. So, with that in mind, he was on equal footing with most. He remembered Ramon's embrace about 10 years back and how proud his sire was. But through the years, those words of praise went sour, until it was no longer spoken of. Meeks knew he was the black sheep, but he wasn't exactly sure how dark. So, what are you up to tonight? Meeks said, shifting gears. Well, I was going to play cards with some of the neighbors, Ramon said, stumbling over every word. Right, of course, Meeks said with a sly smile. Even now, he was lying about something. Whatever it was he was doing, he certainly didn't want anyone to know about it. And that was only making Meeks want to know more. Ramon lingered a bit after Meeks stopped talking, and that was his cue to leave that the younger kindred obviously didn't catch. Well, Meeks said with a smile plastered on his face. Yeah? Ramon asked completely in the dark. You can get the fuck out of here now, Meeks said with the same smile. Ramon smiled, though that smile was relief that he was being released, not from any residual amusement with Meeks' comment. Ramon exited and went back to the guest room, presumably. Meeks still had a little night left to do something. Though he hadn't planned on doing anything, and it was his time for relaxation away from people, Ramon giving him a social problem to deal with got him out of his introspective mood. Paulo, get in here, Meeks bellowed. Paulo took only a moment to appear, but walked out on the terrace confidently. How do I look? Meeks questioned. What do you mean? Paulo asked with his Spanish accent stepping to the forefront. What I mean is what I said. I'm going to crash that party down there, and I need your opinion, Meek said, mocking Paulo's accent for no reason in particular. You look good, Paulo said without hesitation. Don't kiss my ass. Is this what the kids are wearing? I don't look like a fuddy-duddy, do I? Meek said in jest. Paulo shrugged with a smirk, being non-committal, more to fuck with Meeks than anything. He could get away with little things, and in the end, Meeks respected him more than most ghouls, even if he was always an ass hair away from the finest beating he ever took. Meeks nodded, knowing that he looked good, even if he didn't know the crowd. Bring out the drinks, said Meeks. Paulo nodded and turned to do just that. In moments, Paulo returned with 3 women in excellent shape, dressed as maids. The servants here all doubled his food, which was a reason none of the guests there had to go out and have a feeding accident. The elder kindred noticed that these 3 women's heads drooped, as if they weren't fully there. Are you high? Are they high? Meeks asked Paulo. Paulo shook his head no. He could tell that he didn't want to say something, and the only reason he'd have to not say something would be when another kindred was doing something that they didn't want to be known. Meeks grabbed one of the girls' wrists to see them flush. It was lazy, their blood was not flowing well. As far as he could explain it, Ramon's dumbass was drinking too much. Meeks casually walked to the beach with his sleeves and pant legs rolled up. He held his shoes in his hands and let his bare feet touch upon the water. He approached the huge pavilion tent and heard the pulsating hum of rap music. There were women in bikinis prancing about, along with young men with their pants hanging low. The crowd was early teens, mid to late 20s. Meeks could fit in. He was a man that looked to be hovering in his 30s. And he didn't brag, but he was good looking, and looks got people in the door regardless of station. There were big speakers placed in the corners of the tent and bright multicolored lights decorating the ceilings. Meeks just took everything in. He didn't pretend like he belonged. There was no point there. He just put out the aura of someone curious that happened onto a party. And technically, he wasn't lying about that. Meeks was an expert on parties, get-togethers, and or shindigs, and from the looks of things, this party was in a downward swing. People were moving about lazily, entering and leaving. Some were passed out or loitering as if they weren't ready to leave but weren't sharp enough to be actively engaged. A white kid that didn't look older than 20 who sat with a handful of kids spoke to Meeks. "Shit, yo, Christian Bale," he said looking at Meeks. Meeks laughed his ass off. That was the first time he'd ever heard that one. The elder vampire approached the crowd and sat down in a white lawn chair. Meeks nodded and smirked. "What did I miss here?" "Man, dude, little motherfucking Wayne was up here like 20 minutes ago," said the thugged out rich white kid. "Do I know you, homie?" said one of the kids to Meeks. "See that mansion up there? That's me," Meeks said confidently. "What? Shit, we should have invited you. Sorry, man. You doing any more Batman movies?" he said. Meeks shook his head. He didn't mind this little wigger peacocking for his friends, but if you let the good-natured ribbing go on too long, it eventually turned into ridicule. "It's coming out whenever your next album drops, Eminem," Meeks said with a dashing smile. The kids and his hangers-on chuckled, which was a good thing if it was in good fun, but a bad thing if it was too funny. It would put the kid on the defensive, as if he had to address it. The kid, who Meeks was starting to realize was the host of the party, smiled off the insult. When the mood calmed, the little wigger asked, "I got a serious question for you, cuz. I ain't seen you around. Are you a vampire?" Meeks was taken unaware by the kid's bold, accusatory statements, which, incidentally, would have been an obvious joke had he not, in fact, been a vampire. The elder vampire immediately looked into the boy's aura out of instinct and self-preservation. All he saw was a calm anticipation. He couldn't outwardly know what that emotion meant without more information. Meeks played it cool, though mentally prepared himself to physically kill everyone left in this tent if he absolutely had to. Or, in a worst case scenario, flee for his life because they planned to firebomb his ass. It wasn't like it had never happened to him before. The vampire prepared to answer. He had processed all these possibilities in the span of 3 seconds. But the little wigger broke into thunderous laughter. "Nah, shit, he got all scared," said the kid, causing the handful of kids to laugh with him. Meek smirked a bit, but still couldn't help but to wonder why he said vampire. It smacked of some sort of insider joke that he wasn't in on, that he couldn't ignore, just on the strength of it having something to do with vampires. The elder kindred didn't flat out ask what the relevance of accusing him to be a vampire was, but being a superior social predator, he knew how to get information out of people without them knowing he even cared. Meeks employed a high-level facial expression of confusion with a dash of condescending amusement. Most people that saw it knew the other person didn't know what the fuck they were talking about and only smiled to humor them. The kid noticed the expression immediately, and like most, he would rather explain himself than have anyone think he was making jokes only he got. "Dude, you didn't hear about the Jupiter Island vampire?" the kid explained. Big shook his head, giving the same expression until the boy volunteered every piece of information he had. A few weeks back, people have been reporting some dude up in motherfuckers' houses, all up in people's bedroom. "John saw some dude," said the host of the dying party. John chimed in. "Yeah, I saw a dude coming out of my guest house. He broke the fuck out like he was the fucking Flash. If you would've saw how fast he was moving." Meeks nodded and played the part of concerned human. "So, did you get a good look?" "Nah, son. All I saw was a blur," replied John. Meeks was putting together theories in his head. From what it sounded like, they were dealing with an incubus, a kindred that preferred to feed from sleeping victims. He knew a few Nosferatu that chose to feed that way because they were too hideous to blend into proper society, but most didn't get so close to getting caught. This was the reason there was no hunting on the island. High-tech security systems and high-profile victims was not an easy feed. "He come up in my house, he gonna get clapped up," said the wigger host. Meek smiled, but it was more likely he'd die if he raised a hand to a vampire than the other way around. He took a look at his phone and it was 4:30. Since he hadn't checked the time until sunrise, Meeks didn't want to risk it. Seeing he didn't even check his sleeping chamber to see if it were prepared. "Well, kids, it's past my bedtime. I have to be shoving off," the elder vampire said while dropping his shoes and stepping in them. The kids all seemed genuinely disappointed he was leaving, seeing he had just breathed a little life into a party that was otherwise in its death throes. "What's your phone number? Tell me when you do another one," Meek said to the kid, who by all appearances was not more than 10 years younger than him. The elder vampire left on a good note and had another connection from nothing that could dovetail into something, or not. Meeks made the trek back to his mansion. He walked up through the terrace and made a conscious effort to lock the door, seeing it was bothering him on a number of levels. The elder kindred walked towards his room. It was a room that could have been bigger than some people's entire houses. Hot tub, 120-inch TV that could have doubled as a movie theater screen. Art that was more than some people made in an entire year. Meek slid away a painting where there was a wall safe. Before he punched in numbers, he looked around. Not that it'd mean anything if there wasn't an invisible vampire hiding, so he didn't leave it to chance. He punched in numbers to the keypad and little sensors with invisible lasers surged through the room. If anyone who wasn't him was in the room, it would have triggered. Meeks waited a few moments to make sure nothing sounded before opening the door to his sleeping chamber. In New Orleans, he didn't particularly go through such precautions because he had servants all about, but here he had very little safety net, so no security measure was off limits. When he was certain there was nothing in the room, he typed a series of numbers that caused a wall to slide away. He could hear the silent churning of metal. Meeks entered, then approached another metal door that he had to use a physical combination lock that one may see on a high-end safe. That door opened to a room with a bed, a few security deposit boxes on the wall, and a wall of monitors on another. He literally got people that designed bank vaults to construct his chamber 50 years ago. Then 20 years ago, he doubled up and got people to build the vault around the first vault. He assumed that in another 20 years, he'd have to update things again, but in lieu of a security team, this was his insurance. The elder kindred laid down and thought nothing more of the world for a time. He slept with a measure of confidence he was safe. When Meeks woke, he began the process of exiting his chamber. He noticed immediately that his bedroom door was cracked open as if someone had attempted to enter in the day. The elder vampire's mind raced. How was that possible? He had the most high-tech security on Earth in this place. Even to open his door would have sent off warning bells. He thought back to the rumor of the ancients taking their blood price to live in their domain. Because frankly, the only thing he could see breaching his defenses was magic. Meeks went through the tedious process of opening his vault just so that he could check all the surveillance footage. And after he examined all his stock, he found absolutely nothing of value. It was as if it never happened, except it did. The elder kindred decided to go looking for Paulo. His first stop was the kitchen. The Latin ghoul was stirring and warming up a cup of blood, conceivably for when he woke up, but seeing he had been up for a while, his timing was slightly off. "Did you go into my room?" said Meeks before greeting his daytime man. "No," was all he said. Meeks thought for a moment. "What about Ramon? Was he in my room?" Paulo shrugged impudently, causing Meeks to roll his eyes with annoyance. Could the ancients be walking amongst them, unaware of modern technology? Was this why humans were having sightings? Meeks took the cup of blood Paulo was warming up. It was bitter and unsatisfying, like an appetizer, and it wasn't just because it wasn't fresh. Many nights he found himself wanting. He wore a silk robe and pressed on to find Ramon sipping blood from a yellow tumbler. The elder kindred bumped into the younger kindred in the hallway, who moved with a purpose. "Hello?" said Ramon to Meeks, as if he intended to keep on going. "Hold on, pard. The art of conversation truly is dead with the young," Meeks said with a smirk. Ramon didn't answer, but his phone rang. Then he smiled, as if he had a legitimate reason to ignore his elder. "Please excuse me," Ramon said to Meeks, whose eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The elder kindred retrieved his phone from his robe pocket and deftly navigated his apps, moving with Ramon slightly so he couldn't just up and leave. Ramon did in fact move all the way to the driveway before hanging up his phone. Meeks was right there before the Latin kindred hopped into his Ferrari. "Oh, I'm in a rush," Ramon said, trying to escape Meeks' presence, but still attempting to be polite about it. "Here, take down my number. Maybe later we'll link up," Meeks said casually, trying not to come off as a nagging parent. Ramon nodded slowly and pulled out his phone. "Wow, is that the iPhone 5? Meeks said. Ramon nodded, on the one hand proud he was amongst the first to have it, but on the other hand annoyed he had another excuse for conversation that would slow him down. Meeks reached his hand out for the phone. It wasn't as if Ramon could say no. The elder kindred deftly navigated the phone, noticing the lock screen was a sunny day in a slum somewhere in Florida. Meeks took the phone through the paces. He could see Ramon getting more and more impatient, but he didn't care. "Would you look at that screen size?" "Sir, I have to go, truly," Ramon said. Meeks nodded and begrudgingly handed over his phone. "I seriously need to talk when you get back." Ramon nodded. Of course. The elder kindred re-entered the house and didn't bother pressing the issue anymore. He decided to prepare for the night. Meeks waited outside of the gates of a random mansion in a Mercedes-Benz, texting Prince Faywell in New Orleans about the iPhone 5. He loved Faywell, his prince, and hated him at the same time. He was the equivalent of a moderate friend from high school that became your best friend later in life purely because they were the only ones left for you to talk to. What was he gonna do, hang out with neonates? That would have been like grown men befriending preschoolers. Meeks slowly walked out towards the secluded patch of land that concealed Ramon's Ferrari somewhat inconspicuously. The elder kindred watched impassively as the neonate hopped a gate with the speed of a raging locomotive. Ramon was moving so fast he didn't notice Meeks standing off to the side. and was blindsided by him a second time before entering his car. "Hold on now, youngin'. You're not leaving until we have our little talk," Meek said with authority. Ramon slammed his car door. "What the fuck do you want?" he said, completely ignoring Meek's station. "Wow, that's how you talk to me?" Meek said, but was promptly interrupted. "Cut the shit. What the fuck do you want?" Ramon said, losing all hints of civility. "You were feeding here, weren't you?" Meek said, deciding he didn't quite feel like dancing around things either. Ramon shrugged. "It is what it is," he replied with his Spanish accent. The neonate paused. "How did you even find me?" Ramon questioned, no longer confirming or denying anything. Meek smiled. "I enabled the locator on your phone." Ramon smiled, as if amused at the obvious yet sneaky play his elder made. Meeks grew deadly serious when he spoke next. "Feeding isn't all you do, though, is it? I've been making calls and doing a bit of sleuthing tonight. Elders have turned up missing that's visited here, and you've been killing them." Ramon smiled, but not out of nervousness or amusement. It was a look of pure malice, or of warning, like an animal baring its teeth. "Alder Meeks, that is a dangerous accusation," Ramon spoke while gesturing with his index finger as if to say, "No, no, no, naughty boy." "Why? You're not going to use your powers on me. I'm your elder," Meek said, much more dryly than he usually spoke. "Well, you see, that doesn't make sense now, does it? If I were the type of man you are accusing me to be, logic dictates that not only will I use powers on you, I'd have to kill you." Ramon came back in a low and confident tone of voice. "Why do you think a neonate like me is capable of such a feat? I am a neonate," said Ramon, as if he was curious to know how he connected those dots. "Well, if you want me to tell you my nefarious scheme," Meeks paused dramatically, then his voice went up an octave in jest. "Gladly." Ramon crossed his arms. "You have been living here, what, 3 months? And the kindred that come here are gone for nights on end, because most merely visit. So, you systematically break into their houses, tamper with their security systems, learn it, then kill them when they return. You even came for me last night, didn't you? You had months to figure it out, didn't you?" "Why didn't you kill me?" Meeks asked. Ramon smiled, then said flat out, "I ran out of time. Sun was coming up." Meeks nodded matter-of-factly, as if it was no big deal. Though he didn't dismiss the irony of a party saving his life. "There are plenty of reasons to kill your social betters. What was your reason?" asked Meeks politely. Ramon looked as if he were ready for something physical to happen. He was obviously on the defensive, but not at all scared. "I was running from House Darden. I needed the strength to fight them when they came for me. They don't come to this place much, so what better place to hide from them than on their own property? It didn't start off as me diablerizing my elders, but I sort of developed a taste for it now. I mean, just on the powers I can take when I do it. You don't realize how strong I've gotten in 3 months' time," said Ramon. "So you like to speed, but you haven't sucked out invisibility yet, huh?" Meek said, clarifying for himself why he didn't turn invisible when he breached people's mansions. "Unfortunately, I've only gotten as far as hiding the strength of my blood, but I can't do that yet," said Ramon confidently. "So, what's next for you? What's next for Ramon?" Meek said in a condescending manner. Ramon smiled. "You know, I'm going to kill you now, right?" "I have to," said Ramon. "You're not going to lay a hand on me," Meek said confidently. Ramon shook his head and slowly revealed his presence as a predator. He was strong, much stronger than most, maybe even him, but Meeks didn't flinch. "Why aren't I going to lay a hand on you?" Ramon said as if curious. "Because frankly, you may be strong, but you're a dumbass. You never talk to a venture that means to kill you," said Meeks. Ramon attempted to surge at Meeks with the speed of a charging beast, but he couldn't. He reached his hands out and couldn't form them into claws or wrap his hands around his neck. "I guess there's nothing left to do but kill you," said Meeks. "How?" said Ramon. Meeks tapped his head. "I commanded you not to use your powers on me or to lay a hand on me while we were talking," said the elder kindred. Ramon turned as if to run. "Dude, the very first thing I told you is that you're not going anywhere until we're done talking. And does it look like we're done?" Meeks said. Ramon had nothing. He wanted to kill his elder with all his heart, but his mental commands overrode his better judgment like a shackled dog. He tried everything he could to break his mental hold, so he turned to pleading. "I'm still a member of House Darden. You can't do this, or you'll break your allegiance." "Oh, but I can. I gave them a ring before I came out tonight, and not only do they not care if you die, they asked me as a personal favor to kill you," Meek said with a devilish smirk. Ramon did not reply. He merely resisted as hard as he could. He could feel the shackles breaking the more his fear rose. Meeks had Ramon in the palm of his hand, but he would not keep him there. The moment he knew his life was in danger, truly, he'd break free of all his commands and do whatever was necessary to defend himself. Meeks knew that even in this state, when the teeth flew, he may not come out of this unscathed, but in this moment, it didn't matter. Meeks stepped in close while Ramon backed away. He grabbed him with all his might and sank his teeth into his neck. The elder almost didn't feel Ramon's resistance. He had almost certainly broke his mental chains. He didn't hear anything over the bliss. This was the satisfaction he was looking for when the taste of blood was weak like watered-down whiskey. He felt Ramon tear into his back with claws as gnarled and sharp as eagle's talons. But Meeks was like a crocodile locked in a death spin. The only way he would let go is if he was killed. He had drained someone before, an old mentor in fact, and when he did it then, it was out of mercy. She didn't want to be what she was, and he was the only way out for her. But now, this was a selfish thrill that was wrong on so many levels. If he stopped now, he could leave Ramon his soul. He wouldn't consume his essence. He could go where the dead went when they died by merely tearing his throat out. But in this moment, he did not think he could stop. With Ramon's last bit of strength, he jumped high into the air with Meeks latched onto him like a parasite. The force of the impact smashed them both through the windshield of the Ferrari, but the elder kindred hung on. Meeks felt Ramon relax as if he was done with the mortal world, but the world was not quite done with him. He had taken in everything Ramon ever was. The elder kindred experienced a rush of emotions, snippets of memories and ambitions that were not his own. It overtook him in the time it may have took one to blink. And like a dream, most of that information that seemed so vital was all but forgotten. Meeks paused and pulled himself all the way onto the car while pulling glass out of his face. With one mighty yank, he pulled the rapidly decaying body of Ramon into the car, slinging it into the passenger seat. Meeks held his head low, embarrassed about his momentary lack of self-control, but exhilarated by the rush. When the moment of contemplation passed, he rifled through Ramon's pockets for the car keys. The neonate's body slumped and slumped and slumped until it withered away to dust. Meeks drove away. Meeks stood on the beach outside of his mansion. He was moments before leaving for New Orleans. He contemplated on the events of the night before, with Ramon and what he did. He didn't feel any different, but he was different. The kindred reached into his pocket and retrieved Ramon's iPhone 5. He thought to keep it, but something about that turned him off. It made him feel like a serial killer who kept trophies of their victims. What he did was a one-time thing. Well, two-time thing. But he wasn't going to do it anymore, is what he told himself. Meeks heard Paulo out of the terrace calling to him so he would make his flight. The elder took a look at the phone one more time, and that gesture of reverence for the dead was the most any kindred could hope for in terms of a funeral. Then he tossed it into the sea. Meeks began to run as if running could undo what he did. Then he realized he was running at speeds no mortal man could achieve. It was part of Ramon's soul that attempted to pour out of him. He stopped running, not even knowing why he did it in the first place. He vowed never to use his speed again, because to do so would be disrespect to Ramon's memory. Then he looked at the distance he had to run from his mansion. He ran back to the house at supernatural speeds. Screw Ramon. Respect had never really been his strong suit. Oh, look here, children, another one that is in the books. Even when a vampire goes to another place, it seems as if they got to take their fangs with them. I can't remember the last time Grave Digger Queen has taken a vacation. Well, maybe digging these graves is my vacation. Lots of cardio involved. Anyway, night, children.